Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm your host, Daniel Sanderson, and here in studio we've got Steve as normal, and also Ian Dunlop. Dunlop is a special guest, and Ian is a Australian engineer, writer, and energy expert with a particular interest in the intersection of corporate governance, corporate responsibility, and climate change. Previously, Ian worked in oil, gas, and coal exploration and production, and scenario and long-term energy planning. So let's welcome Ian to the studio. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for the invitation. Very pleased to join you. Hi, Steve.
It's good to see you, mate. It's been how many years since we've been in touch? It must be 10 since we were last in the same room.
Well, probably, yes. We talked.
Yeah.
So did you guys have any direct collaboration on that climate change Code Red article? I think I've seen you actually refer to Steve's work in some of the footnotes. And so I was just curious if that was an exchange of email or anything of the sort.
Oh, yeah, no, we certainly talked quite extensively. I mean, we wrote that fatal calculation paper. I think it was, when was it, last year, the year before, I think.
2019, I think it was, yeah.
That's right. I mean, we've been concerned about the misuse of climate modelling and the economic end of it for quite a long time. Steve's written extensively about it. I think we were particularly incensed over the Nobel Prize award to William Nordhaus and the way in which that was misused. So fatal calculation sort of partly came out of that. But the Club of Rome were also somewhat cranky about the award at the time for the same sort of reasons. So yes, I think we exchanged emails at the time. We read a lot of Steve's stuff. We referenced it in the report.
Nice. Steve, I'm actually going to get you to do a bit of a summary of where you're at in terms of your paper, your submittal, just so that I want to see if Ian's actually familiar with the behemoth of a submittal and paper that should be making waves in the near future.
Well, that's a new one. You know my paper from Globalizations, of course, Ian.
Yeah.
Okay, and that was written, of course, for a non-technical audience. And then as a result of that, one of the review editors of Proceedings of the Royal Society said they'd like one for scientists. So we've written that and submitted it. We're still waiting on word back from referees, but that's actually on the the ArcSiv archive. And that pretty much repeats the points in Globalization, but it also adds the mathematics both behind the ludicrous assumptions and conclusions that Nordhaus reached, and then alternative projections we can make about what the likely damage to the economy is going to be in society and in the environment as well, out of the 4-degree temperature level that he thinks is an optimum increase in temperature, as in his Nobel Prize speech. So that's the first one, and then I've been dragged back into it again because the paper turned up. Pardon me about my background. I was to update that. Hang on a second. I'll fix that up.
I was trying to do it incognito, Steve.
No, okay. Better than seeing my coffee cup and stuff like that in the background. Not to mention a toilet roll for the poor man's tissue paper. I had there a moment ago. So we're doing another one, which is on tipping points. And I don't know if you've seen this paper. It's by Dietz and a few others, and Gernot Wagner, and who, until I read this paper, I had some time for. Have you seen that paper by Dietz and co?
I've got it in front of me here, along with your Royal Society paper as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yay! How do I get one of those, Steve?
I'll send a copy. I didn't realize it's actually freely available on archive, but I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah. That paper, I mean, when I read it, I thought, what on earth is somebody who's written a paper about how economics needs a revolution, getting away from equilibrium thinking and so on? That's Gernot Wagner, and a paper he wrote, I think, in Vox or some other popular Res Publica, I think it was. How on earth is somebody who wrote that contributing to this? And to summarize, I don't know if Daniel's seen the actual paper. They claim that there's the usual hypothetical world that they've got in the future. So at the moment, we have such things as ice on Greenland and ice on West Antarctica. And we have the Gulf Stream, which is technically known as the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. We have all these elements. There's eight elements they looked at. And they said that a world in which those 8 were all triggered, so we lost Greenland ice, we lost to West Antarctic, even the methane hydrates that are stuck on the ocean floor, they all came to the surface and did what they'll do to the climate. All those are triggered. The change in the level of GDP when that happens, and so up to the year 2300, will be 1.4% smaller than in a world on which those changes didn't occur. Yeah. Now, that is beyond ludicrous. And yet this is the sort of nonsense that these guys spout because they're living in their own little echo chamber and they bounce back their own pathetic concepts off each other and never get out in the real world and say, this is crazy.
Yeah. Well, look, I totally agree with that. I mean, we've put out a paper just recently called The Degrees of Risk. Can the banking system survive 3 degrees C of warming? And the reason we've done it is that in Australia, the regulators have started stress testing the banks on terms of their climate impact. And they've been looking at those at, say, 3 degrees C and 4 degrees C, and suggest that they should do stress testing against those levels. Also look at what's happening internationally. You have regulators, the central bank regulators, this so-called network for greening the financial system, which has been looking at stress testing the global central banks in terms of the stability of the financial system. You see the same thing occurring where they're talking about stress testing at 3 degrees C, 4 degrees C. And I mean, the problem with this is that the best, I think, analysis we've seen scientifically and from security analysts is that at 4 degrees C, you don't have a civilization. It's collapsed.
Exactly.
At 3 degrees C, you have social chaos. And you've already seen that in some small ways around the world. I mean, it happened in a small sense here during the Bushfires last year, where the impact of those fires was really starting to demonstrate the break in the way society operates. If you look at what's happened in North America in the last 6 months in the Californian bushfires, you're seeing the same sort of thing. So I mean, what the problem we have is that you can't just use risk and probability in the sense that they're trying to do it. When you get to levels like this, I mean, I think it was oh gosh, I've forgotten his name now. It'll come back to me. One of the economists in the UK, basically, Skidelsky, that's Robert Skidelsky, was talking about this contrast between risk and uncertainty in the context of the global financial crisis, and saying that the big problem is that the financial markets have interpreted everything in terms of risk, whereas there are a whole lot of things you can't do that because it's uncertain.
Yeah.
If you look at the impact on tipping points in the climate debate, the IPCC have not included any real analysis of those in the assessment reports they've done up until this year, AR6, on the grounds that they didn't know enough about it and therefore they ignored it. I mean, the problem with that, quite simply, is these are the biggest risks we actually face.
Yeah.
These things trigger, then it's game over. I mean, you don't have a civilization. You don't have a global society. So the point is you can't quantify them. You can't assign probabilities in a conventional sense. you have to take the genuine precautionary approach of saying, look, we cannot afford that to happen. So we must do everything possible to ensure it doesn't. And I think that's where this goes wrong. I mean, there's just this sort of complete mix-up between, how you handle uncertainties and how you handle risk.
And it's also maybe how you handle weather and how you handle climate. And this is the thing which I was most horrified by when I got into this literature. I didn't start contributing in a serious sense to this until after I wrote my paper in 2019, which I did the work for in 2016, I suppose, where I showed the role of energy in production. And I said once I made a positive contribution saying you must treat energy as an input to labour and capital to explain output rather than treating it as an independent unit, then I thought I could read the literature. And I must admit my personal reaction when I heard that Nordhaus got the Nobel was I'd forgotten what I'd read about him back in the days of the Limits to Growth study. And I thought, oh, well, at least they're giving it to somebody who's working on climate change. Then, because I've now started getting into the area and I thought I could contribute, well, I better read the literature. And you know what I'm like. I read it, I go back every last comment they make, I go back and see where that came from. And I was, within a short while, I was literally so much in shock over the stupidity of what they were doing that I had my hands in my head like this, having read one comment. And my wife walked in at the time. She totally has no interest in this area whatsoever, a very Buddhist person as well. And she said, what are you doing? I said, I'm reading about climate change. She said, well, why do you read that stuff? Nobody wants to know about it. You can't do anything. If we die, we die. And that sort of slapped me out of it. But I thought, these guys have completely misunderstood what climate change is about. And by doing that, they've put it in the realms where you can use risk and probability. And even on that front, they're not doing it properly. And consequently, people who are using things like a 3 and 4 degrees Celsius as something they can do risk assessments on, if we get 3 and 4 degrees and they're still alive, the risk assessment they'll be doing is whether they want to be eaten by a tiger or a lion around the Arctic Circle.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a long history to this scientifically. I mean, go back to, I think, 2009, the Royal Society did an entire exercise on the implications of a 4 degrees C world. And that wasn't very pleasant. I mean, that information is out there. People know about it. The concern we had in the degrees of risk paper we put out 3 or 4 weeks ago is that if you end up with those sort of assumptions being adopted by the key regulators in the global financial system, and you encourage people to assess the impact of 3 and 4 degrees C, what's been happening right through this process, and it started with the so-called Task Force on Climate-Related Risk Disclosure, which Mark Carney was instrumental in initiating way back, I think it started in 2015, and then recommendations coming out in 2017, which essentially encourages companies to disclose the financial risks they're exposed to because of climate. Investors are aware what is likely to happen. And that's all voluntary. And it's been a good exercise in the sense of really making companies face up to the implications of climate and start to think about it in a way they weren't before. But the problem is that it's reactive in the sense that it says, look, if somebody puts this policy in place, what's going to be the impact on you? What's been happening is that people go to the major global institutions like the IPCC, like the International Energy Agency. They take the scenarios that are sort of on the shelf and say, well, how's that going to affect me? And of course, if you're a coal company in Australia, you say, well, my cost of production is the lowest part of the cost curve, and therefore I'll still be standing when most others are dead, and so it's going to affect me a bit, but it won't be the end of the world. Or we'll keep going for decades to come, as our government keeps telling us. Now, and the problem with that is that people become very complacent. It doesn't really, after a period of time, achieve the objective of really fronting the real risk implications of climate. And if you then get the major regulators around the world and in Australia starting to say, well, you really ought to stress test your organisations at 3 and 4 degrees C. If people are not taking an independent view in terms of their fiduciary responsibilities of board directors, which they should be saying, well, what is the real risk we face and how are we then going to manage it? Instead, they go and pick up something off the shelf and say, well, we'll assume that's the case and we'll monitor everything against that. You end up with people just saying, well, if the regulators are telling us that 3 and 4 degrees C is acceptable and realistic, then it gets locked into the system. And then you end up with this sort of groupthink nonsense where a bunch of lemmings all on the same pathway. And nobody is saying, well, what the hell does 3 and 4 degrees C actually mean?
Exactly.
You don't see that discussion in the corporate world or in the investment world. I mean, if you look at what we currently we're seeing in the lead up to the Glasgow COP meeting, everybody's congratulating themselves on committing to net zero emissions by 2050. Well, I mean, that is far too late.
Absolutely.
We've got to do it much more quickly than that.
And I have to point out that net is the word that I'm hung up on.
Yeah. No problem. I mean, it's got to be zero as quickly as you can do it. But none of this discussion is going on. I mean, we're sort of, going blindly into a COP meeting with an assumption that net zero by 2050 is a marvelous step forward and everything will be solved if we aim for that. Whereas it's completely inappropriate. I mean, it's just totally inadequate. We can't stay below 1.5 degrees C now. It's locked in. We'll be very lucky to stay below 2. And if you're taking net zero by 2050, you can pretty much guarantee we're headed for 3 or higher. So, I mean, that's the world we're facing, and there's no honest conversation about this going on anywhere in the system at the moment.
Hey,
I
Ian,
know.
I have a question, Ian. This thing about the inertia, there's about a half a degree of inertia. Would you say that stays the same whether you're at 1.5 or 2 degrees, or is it pretty much you can think of the inertia being half a degree?
How do you mean inertia? In the sense of the delay in the system before the full?
Yeah, like if we shut it off, we'd still see a half a degree temperature rise, right?
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to estimate it. It would depend on a number of other things happening too, frankly. And I think in the way you actually do that, the way in which carbon sinks are actually operating, whether they're still functioning or they're not. It seems to me that it's very much dependent on what temperature levels you've reached before you actually try and shut it off. Because a lot of things, I mean, sinks will not be working to anywhere near the same extent as temperatures rise.
Yeah.
We're already getting concerns about the Amazon turning into a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. And so I think you've got to be a bit careful with that sort of exercise. I mean, the other point we made in a number of our earlier reports is that the effect of aerosols, of course, is cancelling out emission reductions. So you're not going to see a great deal of change in the warming trajectory we're on for probably the next 10 or 20 years, irrespective of anything we do in the meantime. Now, of course, in the context of the inertia, I mean, that's going to, depending where you get to, that's going to affect where we'll end up and how much that inertia really becomes, actually.
Okay, well, let's go back to the policy point and how we've, I guess, become accustomed to the common narrative. And I had an aha moment with the learning about Steve's research and the implicit bias or dogma that's in that economic narrative and how it's actually translating into policy. And I'm seeing it come up again and again. In terms of our current election cycle. I'm Canadian. We have a federal election coming. And I'm just hearing in real time the train wreck of the politicians talking about economic models that are not relevant. it's like an argument amongst like not even the topic and the substrate isn't even correct. So politically homeless, you're just you're just caught in the crossfires of misinformation, and you can see it on display for everybody to see. So I think we got to broadcast. We got to get it. And one of the initiatives that I'm working on with the clips and some of Steve's work is to take other people who are very, very influential, like Shapiro, for example, huge base and following, and outwardly very much against irrational, power grabby. These are kind of the ideas behind the narrative on the other side, but it needs to be responded to in some way, because these audiences are swelling, and it's one of the fronts of the war that you refer to earlier, right? That I'd like to kind of now switch the conversation to, is the warlike front that we have to galvanize towards,
my feeling, and Ian can really comment on me on this front, is that if we had an intelligent economics, which was based on the biophysical foundations of production, then we would have had warnings of this 50, 60 years ago, which were limits to growth fundamentally was, and we would have been able to evade it over that time limit. Given that we've had a delusional economics, which lets people lightly discuss 3 and 4 degree temperature rises as, we'll cope with that much risk, thanks. There's no way that market mechanisms or anything else is going to work. But people have been so saturated with this belief that 3 or 4 degrees is manageable, that it'll take incontrovertible evidence that 2 degrees is not manageable before there'll be a change in sentiment, and you'll get politicians if suddenly realizing, well, oh my God, this is far more serious, we have to stop it, and then doing something rather more serious than net zero by 2050 becomes the only conversation. And we've seen, Dean mentioned the bushfires in America, of course, the floods at the same time on the other side of the country. Even though those have killed hundreds of people, the heat dome, I think it was about 600 excess deaths in the heat dome in northern USA, southern Canada. And then, of course, the floods, a couple of hundred people killed there. It'll take something which wipes out an order of magnitude, 3 orders, 4 orders of magnitude more people in one go, I think, before there'll be any wake up. And that's tragic, but it's to some extent human nature as well. And economists, rather than restraining our nature, have pushed us to continue that delusional nature forward on the precipice.
Yeah, I mean, I unfortunately, I think you're probably right. I mean, if you look at what happened in the bushfires here last year, and they were totally unprecedented, and the full impact of that is still only being gradually revealed, I think, in terms of effect on the ecological systems and so on. Our government response initially, I mean, the usual way Australia operates is people respond very well to emergencies. So came into focus, but it was reactive. And what you're now finding is, of course, time's gone by and people still really haven't been helped to get on top of the problem. People are still sleeping in caravans in some places and so on. And political system moves on, tends to forget until we get to the next problem. Everything has become extremely short-term focused, and it's probably worse here than in most places. We have the overlay of a very high carbon society, which is still totally dependent on coal. And getting the political class out of their sort of myopia is proved to be extremely difficult. So it is going to take something really major to force the issue. Quite what form that'll take, I don't know. But the only thing, I think the other side to the coin, though, is what we are finding here now is that there is a lot more conversation in the community about the fact that we have a complete failure of leadership, politicians to address not only the climate issue, but the fact that in the COVID response to COVID and so on, what's become very clear is we haven't got people who genuinely can take a long-term view, which is based on a sensible interpretation of the science. A bunch of populists who do one or two things right, and then they can't help themselves in terms of trying to get back onto the old growth path and open up the economy in the traditional way. So it's possible, I think, that you may get a more rapid community response than we perhaps have been thinking, Steve, but I'd like to think so. But you may be right. It's going to take something a bit more really unfortunate to force the issue.
Yeah. And I've just got to, if you haven't read the Dietz paper yet, I have to give you some ideas of just how absurd this stuff is. And it's reaching the point where you have to, hopefully have to say, we've clearly been utterly misled. And I think that, to me, the only thing I'm focusing on now is getting that realization out there that you cannot trust what you've been told, and therefore those 3 and 4 degree numbers you're working with are nonsense. And the Dietz paper tried to assess the impact of climate change on the ecology as well as on the economy. So they have all the projections of economic damage from temperature rise, but this was attempting to say things which don't turn up in GDP. And what they used was a concept you'd be familiar with, the willingness to pay estimate, as a way of working out what actually is the value of a non-monetary resource. So in cost-benefit analysis, if you have a local council considering whether they preserve a nature reserve or they convert it into a skateboard park, what they will do is ask people in the local community, what are you willing to pay to maintain the nature reserve? And then they can compare that to the monetary revenue from the skateboard park. And when you're doing that sort of thing, to some extent, Ian and I were bushwalkers, that sort of thing, we'd say we put a lot of value on that, and you'd get a certain number which gives you a valuation of the nature reserve, which is certainly not its precise ecological value, but it does give you a numerical comparison with the skateboard park. Well, Dietz and co. borrowed stuff from Mann and co. in 1995, where they used exactly that same concept to apply to the overall ecology and said, what is the willingness to pay of people in wealthy countries to prevent climate change damage? And they then used that to give you a quantified value of the ecology. And the numbers they plucked out of the air, and I could actually say more locally, it was very smelly part of the year, if you ask me, they plucked out of the air was that a 2.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature would cause a 2% damage to the ecology. Now, having done that, as well as something as ludicrous as that, they then said, assuming then that damages are quadratic, okay, and the damages to the ecology is 100% destroyed at a 17.68 degrees Celsius rise over pre-industrial levels. And you think, oh, come on. If anything, it exposes how stupid this is. 17.6 degrees to make the average temperature of the planet roughly 33 degrees. And that means that for most mammals on the planet would be dead. The only species that are likely to survive that are microflora, microfauna, and that's even around the poles. I don't think the temperature of the planet is, except in the days that it was actually a molten mass of lava, in the time that there's actually been a definable biosphere, it's never been 17 degrees above the pre-industrial level. And here they're saying that much of a rise, is needed to damage. And the other thing is, the same paper they took this from had a projection that the economy would exist out until temperatures were 50 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And people are taking this seriously.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's really got completely out of control and effects. And but I think it comes back to this whole issue of financial markets again. I mean, you get annual qualification that past performance is no indication of what might happen in the future.
Indeed.
Continually told, but I mean, the fact is we have no experience of these sorts of temperature increases other than through a paleoclimate record that we look at. And therefore, this sort of continual interpretation or extrapolation of past economic performance is completely meaningless in the world we're now entering into, because we've moved way out of any conventional boundaries. I think that if you look at the planetary boundary arguments that people like Rockstrom and others have put forward, and hot house Earth nonlinear changes, it's a completely different world. You can't do that.
Yeah, you can't use means and standard deviation from today's climates to predict means and standard deviations in a climate that is that radically altered, and this is what they're doing, and it is when you look at it, it is so horrifyingly bad that if any engineer did that, you wouldn't only sack them, you'd disbar from the profession. But economists get away with it because their stuff is so generally abstract.
You know, that's what I wanted to actually bring up in the previous point, though, Steve, and you kind of reiterated it. It's like I'm imagining a teacher, okay, receiving this from students, okay? I mean, you could talk about, a PhD advisor looking at this. Somebody, your peers have to sign off on this, and no one's looking at it, even asking the question about whether the ecology models are actually accurate. Like what kind of a blind species has been, brewing from within us, these economists? Like, what's wrong with your profession?
This is economist, not ecologist, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a sick profession. And of course, you both now have been critiquing mainstream economics literally for 50 years now. And I became a critic as an undergraduate student when I was 18 in 1971. And I've looking at this stuff by neoclassicals. It's got well beyond saying like it's bad economics or bad mathematics, whatever else. This is species-threatening nonsense.
Yeah, it is. And the scientific community, I think, are starting to speak out on it. Been far too slow, and there have been very few voices prepared to do so. But Andy Pittman's ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes has published a few papers recently on the whole question of how do you use climate modelling in a corporate and sort of financial sense, which is putting up a whole lot of qualifications about really being careful about how you interpret this stuff, because a lot of it is being taken and people are making assumptions that are completely invalid. Given the limitations of the modelling. Now, it doesn't quite go to the extent it needs to in terms of the Dietz paper. But I think there is an increasing awareness of the dangers of this sort of stuff continuing. And of course, we're running out of time. I mean, we're going up to COP with a whole lot of this stuff built in. Complete nonsense.
And what is actually going on there is scientific reticence. And that's a justifiable attitude when you're dealing with other scientists, okay? Because if you know that a physicists are likely to think they're superior to everybody else, of course. However, they're not likely to wade into a chemistry paper because they'll know that there are some elements of chemistry they don't understand. So there's a tendency for physicists not to criticize chemists, et cetera, and they extend the same courtesy, professional courtesy, to economists. But what they're presuming is economists behave the same way. And that presumes that they're following the scientific method. Now, when you look at what economists do, they haven't even reached that stage yet. They're still back in the great book stage. They're I call them pre-Galilean, pre-Copernican in their approach to how one assesses economic issues. And when scientists realize just how bad their work is, then that reticence will break down. And I'm gradually bringing a few and more scientists involved in the critiques that I'm helping to write. But we really need the scientists to take on and actually argue for the elimination of economists from any work on climate change. We don't want their help. We want them out of the way, because there's they are responsible for all the delaying numerical estimates that have meant our policy response has been so weak so far. And there's no chance for them to reform themselves overnight and suddenly become scientists.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether David Spratt mentioned it in one of your earlier conversations, but we put out a paper in 2018 called What Lies Beneath the Understatement of Existential Climate Risk.
Mm.
And John Schellenhuber, who was the founder of the Potsdam Institute, did the foreword to that report. And what he said in it quite clearly is, look, there comes a point where conventional economic analysis is completely useless in looking at the types of risk we now face or threats we face from climate change. And you just have to move to a precautionary approach, which recognizes that we cannot afford for certain things to happen, full stop. And that's where you get into this question of, well, how do you do it? And that brings you back to the whole idea that you need mobilization a bit akin to wartime to actually achieve it. Because, I mean, I don't like the analogy particularly, but the fact is it is the sort of thing you have to do. You have to say, look, there is one thing above all else which we have to stop happening, and we need to devote all of the resources to essentially achieve that. I mean, with this tipping point issue, I mean, that's the problem. If these things take off to any substantial extent, it's beyond our control.
Yeah.
And we don't know enough in terms of exactly how these things might unfold and how fast. But what you do know enough about is they're there, and you can see the beginnings of them now starting to happen. You have to stop it.
Yeah. And the two that worry me the two most obvious ones happening now are the Arctic summer sea ice, which of course everybody has had on their radar because we know how fragile that area is, and we've got the data, quite substantial data about the retreat in the ice and thinning and so on. So that's the most obvious tipping point. And that alone, as you know, would be, if we go from totally white to totally black, effectively, you go from 90% reflecting to 90% absorbing, and the impact in terms of equivalent increase in the temperature of the planet from solar radiation that's retained rather than reflected is equivalent to 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which is roughly 40 years worth of emissions at the current rate. Now, so some of what we're seeing with the weather volatility in Europe and America is coming out of that. I've seen some scientific research now collaborating that. But the other one, which is surprising, because people, again, we don't know these things. We've never turned off the Gulf Stream before, okay? So we don't know what's necessary to do it. And most of the studies that I was looking at from about a decade ago were assuming it would take 2 or 3 centuries and maybe a 3-degree increase in temperature to do that. But recent empirical data is indicating quite a substantial slowdown. And it may even be that AMOC tips at the level of temperature rise we're talking about now, which is of the order of 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And over a time frame, there may be decades, not centuries. So if that happens, we're in a totally different planet. And I think it's possible to consider reversing the Arctic, because it is feasible to imagine putting a reflective technology on the Arctic and turning it back into something that reflects. But if the AMOC goes, I mean, how on earth do you restart an ocean current that links the south pole to the North Pole? You can't even have a conversation about it.
Yeah, I mean, you get completely contradictory results in the sense that Europe will get colder, or parts of it will get colder, other parts heat up, and so on. I mean, Sir David King wrote the foreword to our Degrees of Risk report, and he has the Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge now, which is specifically at how do you refreeze the Arctic.
Yeah,
seriously, and that's the sort of stuff we may be forced into doing because of the inertia in taking serious action. So you are at that point where we have to stop these things occurring. And we need a conversation about, well, how are you going to manage the global cooperation to actually achieve it? Because at the moment, all we've got is the conventional sort of belligerence between the US and China and Australia, the US coattails and what have you. Everybody talking in conventional terms, but what the COP meeting in Glasgow should be talking about is, now, how are we going to stop this tipping point phenomenon from getting away from us? Because nothing else is going to work. I mean, the only thing that will work now in terms of avoiding that is to get emissions down extremely quickly. And most of the stuff we're talking about, whilst it's all good and there's a lot of work being done on solutions and so on and so forth, most of these things take time. So you're actually going to have to reprioritize all of the solution approaches that have been canvassed about how you do it in 10 years as opposed to how you do it in 30. Because the brutal facts are that if you go back over 30 years since the beginning of this negotiation from 1992 and what have you, we've achieved precisely nothing in the critical issue, which is to cut emissions. They are still going up at worst case levels. Now, we've done nothing at all. And now we're saying we have another 30 years to fix the problem, which is complete nonsense.
Yeah.
So we need to, I mean, the entire conversation has to change away from, conventional economic modelling and all this sort of stuff that has been holding it back, into a question of mobilisation and how are we going to stop these critical issues actually occurring.
And the one I think we can stop is the Artic. That's I think the one we have to focus on because if that goes, it'll trigger the others. That's the tipping cascades argument from Lyndon and Stefan. And I think in some ways we've got to consider how do we reduce the the temperature of the planet. There's no way we can fine-tune it. We have to put these into reverse. And to me, I think in some ways the whole international agreement thing is partly why we've failed. And it's partly the lobbyists that want to continue the fossil industry for short-term reasons are happy to have that happen. Did you see the expose where two lobbyists were interviewed by what they thought were potential clients in Washington, and they were actually investigative reporters. And these two lobbyists were bragging about how they supported carbon taxes because they knew they'd never happen.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera. I think it's the same thing with national agreements. One reason that the fossil groups are happy to have these talk fests occurring because they know that nothing significant will be done because of them. And to my way of thinking, the only way we're going to see real action is actually at the national level, because that's the only point where the public can put pressure on the politicians to do something. Otherwise, it's just a gab fest.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the whole argument about net zero by 2050, I mean, everyone's congratulating themselves on having reached that point. I mean, whether you talk the big corporates like Exxon and Shell and BP and what have you, you talk investment groups like Climate Action 100, and I think they have, probably the biggest coalition of anybody there. But the fact is that it is, as Michael Mann says, little more than soft denial. I mean, if we stick to that, it's game over. So it has to be accelerated. None of them want to get out of the box and be the first to lead to say it. So it'll be a matter of other people forcing the issue, and particularly communities forcing the issue. So the more this is discussed and a different conversation initiated, the better, frankly. Look at the recent announcement by Murdoch. They are now going to come out supporting a net zero by 2050 target. And some of their newspapers are apparently going to run spreads on the importance of all sorts of solutions to achieve that. I mean, that's the same thing. I mean, it's basically soft denial on the basis it's no longer tenable to completely deny the entire premise of climate change because of what's happening. But this is just slowing it all down. And it's basically predatory delay, trying to delay it as long as so short-term cash flow from the fossil fuel industry continues. And you see it in the responses to from the oil and gas companies here. I mean, our coal's better than everybody else's because it's better quality, so keep on going for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Ministers tell us our gas is, of course, extremely important as a transition fuel. So we should be building massive new projects to ensure that the poverty alleviation in Asia continues. Nobody is focusing on the fact that if we do this, the world will collapse. And that's the discussion that must be out there in a way that we haven't seen it. So the more the bushes can be beaten before the COP meeting along those lines, the better.
That's one reason we're writing a letter to PN, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. When you try to pronounce it as a word, it has a strange outcome. But we're writing a letter to them about this Dietz paper, and hopefully that will at least raise some attention at COP26. But yeah, the real crime is not denialism, but trivialism.
Yeah.
And that's what the economists have provided the intellectual muscle for trivialism, and the the coal and gas industries and Murdoch have provided the funding and the outlet for it. And one thing which intrigues me is what's going to happen to those people when everybody else realises that they've been deceiving both themselves and us. What happens?
Yeah, and I think there's also another dimension, is that if you look at where we come from since World War II, I mean, very few people today have any experience of a genuine emergency.
Yeah.
Apart from refugees and people who've been, in the midst of it in the Middle East and what have you, most of which has been caused by Western interference, but that's but if you look in Western societies and even in China, I mean, real extreme emergencies, there's little experience of. And certainly amongst the political class, I think in Western society, there's virtually nobody in those circumstances. And so people can't think in those terms and don't want to. So if you raise the idea of existential threat that civilization might collapse, it's pretty hard to get an audience. We just don't want to know about that.
Yeah, that's true.
That is the position now in, is that we are going to be faced with a genuine mobilisation to get on top of this. Nobody is prepared for that. We've just produced a report a few days ago by a small group called the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, which is a group of retired military people mainly, on the whole question of applying military preparedness and planning thinking to the broader questions of human security. I mean, this is not national security in the conventional sense, in the way in which militaries here in Canada, in the UK and the US tend to think about it, but human security in the broader context. I mean, how are we going to respond to the impact of climate change in regions like Southeast Asia, for example, where you may well have 1 billion people on the march because they're going to be forced out of their normal habitat by virtue of what is likely to happen, and quite possibly within, say, the next 20 or 30 years.
And the other possibility too is actually, I mean, we tend to focus on the developing regions of the world as where you're going to see the first major impacts. Now, I've got to admit, I was blindsided and stunned by the first, clear example of, astronomical temperatures occurring in southern Canada, the town of Lytton, and with it is quite possible that the catastrophic damages that finally wake people up won't happen in the equatorial regions. They may well happen in the subpolar, and that to me, I mean, you don't wish this upon anybody, but if you want to wake up people, if it happens to rich, wealthy people rather than poor, that's when people pay attention. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to look at what happened with Hurricane Ida in New York. I mean, Louisiana was prepared because of what happened with Katrina.
Yeah.
The damage was still horrific, but nonetheless, they didn't suffer, mortality, deaths, and so on to the same extent they might have done. But New York and the eastern coast of the US was not. And so, a far worse impact than might have been the case, actually. So, I mean, I think, and the same applies here. I mean, we talk about, as you say, the developing world, but Australia is going to be one of those places badly hit by all of this. And the same applies to the US in broader terms. You already see it in California and the rest of it. Canada, as you say. So you're quite right. I mean, I think people really haven't understood the full potential impact of these things and where it might occur.
Yeah. The temperate regions may be, a whole lot of reasons as to why, but the temperate zones may be more affected than the tropical and subtropical.
Yeah.
And I mean, that sort of thing, if it happens in India, even if, like as you see in the Kim Stanley Robinson's opening chapter, if you've read Ministry for the Future, which I was disappointed by as a book, by the way, but the opening chapter has millions of people dying in one day because of a wet bulb temperature catastrophe in northern India. What if, and that'll just be shrug, in my opinion, for the West. But if something similarly catastrophic happens in Canada or the Netherlands or, you go the east coast of America, then we'll get their attention. But I think your point about the military, I think, as you said, we don't have politicians who've got any experience with truly existential threats. And neither do the military anymore, but at least they're supposed to think about existential threats.
Yeah.
So what was the feedback from that military group about their expectations?
Well, I mean, what we've quite deliberately done is not to focus on conventional national security, because what we don't want, I think, is the militarization of the whole idea of climate change, so we end up national standoffs in the conventional sense. But thinking about human security in the broader sense is critically important, because unless you have to prepare for these things, then it's guaranteed that we're going to end up in an absolute shambles. And you can see that we're absolutely not prepared at the present time. We've started off a campaign now, which is, it remains to be seen how much buy-in we will get. The initial response has been, I think, a lot of people quite interested, but it's got to be taken much more broadly than that. And there are linkages. I mean, similar things have been happening in other countries in looking at climate and security in that sort of context. So it's early days, actually, to give you an honest response to that, Steve, but I'll keep you informed.
I'm glad it's happening, and I've got contacts in the US Navy, and I asked about what's happening inside there, and as to much of my contact to say there was no preparation taking place in the US Navy or Army for this. So, but I think they're going to be pulled in very rapidly when it happens, and in many ways, frankly, the sooner they start thinking about it, the better.
Well, I think the thing you have to think about is if you have to move to a genuine global mobilization, then why are we spending all this money on submarines and frigates and nuclear missiles and God knows what? I mean, critical issue everybody is going to have is how do we survive climate change? It's the same for the Chinese, the same for the US, the same for the Australians and the developing world. I mean, it is buying more and more sophisticated tools to kill ourselves when climate will probably wipe the whole lot out if we keep on doing it.
Yeah.
Fundamental rethink in the way in which we look at defence expenditure and what is it for. And I think beyond that, you've got the question, well, what is the role of the military?
Yes.
This offensive-defensive thing, which is the way we've looked at the world since the Cold War and centuries before, I guess, in the context of an existential global threat, becomes completely irrelevant. I mean, yes, you may have breakdowns and conflict between countries for all sorts of reasons, like water shortages and food shortages. But the fact is, unless we find some way of getting a much higher level of global cooperation, none of us are going to get through this, actually. And I think that's the reality. And nobody has any experience of doing it. And people have come out of World War II. I was around for part of it as a very young person. We're in the middle of it. But there are very few people actually in that situation. I think it's going to require a radical change in thinking to get us back into the reality we're now going to face.
Yeah, I would agree. I've been advocating for a warlike response for a while. The heuristic that I use in framing this conversation is if you value human life, then you actually can have a pretty a good tangential plan? Because you had said there's got to be somebody that's in charge that will understand that the survival of the species and the biodiversity of our planet is the number one priority. With whatever plan we decide to implement, and I would say like restricting oil, almost like a quota, right? Like each country gets kind of like a maintenance type of thing. I'm sorry, you don't get to industrialize. It's just, this is the situation that we're in. It's down to the quota. And what does that quota entail? In my opinion, I would say, first of all, it has to do with logistics. A very, very important part of any sort of military plan is the logistics. And militaries are very good at logistics. Wars are won and lost in history over supply lines, as you know. And there's the the idea of boxing people into a castle, this attrition sort of thing. You win the wars that way, by just starving populations out and such. So the function of the war apparatus really should be, like you're mentioning with this group, a humanitarian response, in my opinion. And it's about getting food to the places that we need to get them to. And I'm trying to hierarchically sort of layer that in and think, well, what would the next one? Could it be housing? But wait a minute, like we're not in a constant boom of housing. We have to make do with what we have. It is kind of the idea, right? Like everything is so spurred to economics. And on those kind of, I don't know, it's not a question, right? It's not really a question at all, but just in that sort of, spirit of a description, why don't we, in the last 4 minutes, we got 4 minutes. Why don't we just take turns? Ian, why don't you, comment, and Steve, why don't you wrap us up?
Okay, well, no, I think that sort of thinking is absolutely right. Ironically, during the argument on peak oil a few years back, and it hasn't gone away, by the way, that sort of quota issue was actually seriously discussed. In the sense of how if we're in a world constrained by oil supply, what are you going to do? Now, I mean, climate's different. You're constraining it for different reasons, and you've got to reduce it, not keep, stability and so on. But that sort of thinking was actually going on at one level. And yes, I mean, these are the sorts of things we had to think about. I mean, I think you have to be careful how you phrase it. It's not a warlike response. It's more mobilization akin to wartime.
Yeah.
Otherwise, my Club of Rome colleagues jump on me for a large height and about the implications of, warlike responses and it being interpreted the wrong way. But that said, I mean, no, it is exactly the sort of thing we are going to have to do. And we need leaders who are capable of actually thinking in those terms and being prepared to pick up the implications of actually delivering on that.
And one of my contributions, in which I'm still, because I'm spending so much time demolishing neoclassical nonsense on climate, I haven't had a chance to work on it properly yet. But that's the idea of carbon rationing, bringing in a parallel currency with universal carbon credits. Distributed on a per capita basis, and giving every commodity having both a money price and a carbon equivalent price. And you have to spend the UCCs as well as your money to buy something. And of course, if you even set that to the average of current consumption right now, 95% of the population would be below the average. The 5% would be above would be forced to buy universal carbon credits off the middle class and poor, and that would be fairly extreme pressure to decarbonise, way beyond what would happen with a simple carbon tax or carbon pricing. But I want that I think we need something like that in existence before the crisis hits, because if it's not in existence before, we won't be able to build the structures after, and then we really are talking social breakdown. So my way of thinking, this is, like you said, the war mobilisation, not war behaviour, but that level of mobilisation. That mobilisation also involved rationing consumer behaviour, and we need to be prepared for that before this hits, rather than trying to pick up the pieces afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, again, there's a bit of history of this and things like total energy quotas and what have you that worked on, in the early 2000s. So there's a lot of stuff around about it. You need to pick it up and
Well, Ian, we might actually have to have you on for another hour. I can't believe it. It actually went so fast. I was almost just completely captivated with the two of you having the conversation. I really didn't have to steer that, conversation all that much. So I want to, thank both of you, and another successful hour with Steve. And thanks for tuning in, and thanks again, Ian, for joining us.
And before we go, Ian, I'm going to be in Sydney for political reasons between December and February. So we should catch up. There's some things I'd like to discuss with you about the Australian political scene.
Yeah, I think I've been having some conversations on that already. So.
Oh, good. Okay, well, let's have a chat with you and Ian Victor then.
Okay, good stuff.
Okay, bye.
And nice to meet you, Dan. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.